This is Tommy's Outdoors 132. And today we are going to talk about freshwater lakes. And this is another episode from the series where we talk about the conservation action plans that are being developed as a part of the CANN project. If you're interested what the CANN project is and you missed the previous episodes, we talk about CANN project in general, introducing the project in episode 130. And in the previous episodes, 131, we talk about raised bog. And today, like I mentioned, are freshwater lakes, and especially the areas are Magheraveely, Kilroosky Lake Cluster, I hope I pronounced it correctly, and Lough Arrow. And these are very special habitats and very unique. And why they're very special and why they're very unique, you will learn from our conversation with Professor Frances Lucy, who is the head of the Department of Environmental Science at the Atlantic Technological University, and Dr. Joerg Arnscheidt, senior lecturer at School of Geography and Environmental Sciences at the Ulster University. And another very interesting episode. And during our conversation, among many other things, you will learn about invasive species and how to fight those invasive species and how to prevent their spread. You will learn about native white-clawed crayfish, and you will learn about crayfish plague and what's the story with that. And you will also learn about the importance of the local communities and engagement, and how anglers are being engaged in developing those conservation action plans and helping and supporting scientific work that's going on those lakes. And remember, if you like this podcast and you like to learn more about science and nature science, you should definitely subscribe to Tommy's Outdoors newsletter. The link is in the description of this show, or just go to newsletter.tommysoutdoors.com and subscribe to the newsletter there. You will be notified about new episodes of the podcast, as well as other projects and initiatives that we're working hard here at Tommy's Outdoors to bringing that to you and communicating science and communicating those concepts and presenting balanced views on often difficult and unpopular subjects. Today, I think there was no unpopular or controversial subjects, but very important subjects related to conservation. So without any further ado, ladies and gentlemen, freshwater lakes and Professor Frances Lucy and Dr. Joerg Arnscheidt. Frances and Joerg, welcome to Tommy's Outdoors. It's a great pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
As usual in those cases, I think that the best way to start is with a round of introduction.
All right. Well, my name is Frances Lucy, and here I am in Ireland, in Sligo, at the Atlantic Technological University, where I am an ecologist.
Yeah, my name is Joerg Arnscheidt. I teach environmental science at Ulster University. I am a water scientist in the broadest sense. And currently I'm in the United States as a visiting scholar at the Great Lake, Michigan.
We already had 2 episodes about CANN project, and people interested can look back to the previous episodes and listen about some other work packages and listen to introduction to the CANN project itself. But for people who are just tuning in and they didn't listen to the previous episodes, can you just give a very quick explanation what the CANN project is and what is the work package that you are working on as a part of CANN project?
Okay, well, the CANN project is funded by the European Interreg program, and it's an acronym for Conservation Actions for Nature and Network, where we're working on very many sites of conservation importance across the island of Ireland and also in parts of Scotland. So we're working on freshwater sites. We're different to the other terrestrial people that you've been interviewing. We're a rare and special species here today.
And because it's an Interreg program, the big chance there is also to work on cross-border sites. So we have a number of those that we specifically are working on. Physically cross the border where the management may be different on both sides. We've got one very interesting site, for example, where on one side it's a designated conservation area, and the same lake on the other side is not.
So the border actually runs through the center of the lake, but we know that nature knows no boundaries, and water knows no boundaries either. So it's very interesting.
The lake is called, maybe because of that situation, I don't know, Dummies Lake or Dummies Lough. It's not very large. It's like 5.5 hectares to 6 hectares surface area.
So what is the work that you're doing? You're doing like an ecological assessment, or is it like a purely research and trying to, find out what's there, or is it also part of like a, conservation work and improvement of the habitat and so on?
Yeah, that was the whole idea of the CANN project, really. Of course, we need to monitor at the start and we need to map what's there, but then we're implementing, management, and we're also making recommendations for future management. So that's what it's all about. I think the research that Joerg and I both are involved in is very much applied research. We're not into blue skies research. All our research has positive outcomes, we hope. Well, it definitely has outcomes. Yeah, all about the management.
Yeah, we are at different stages though. In some, like in the CANN project, there are surely sites where they pretty much at the start of the project were aware that there would be one big issue, and they already would have mapped out exactly what they would do to mitigate that issue. And then there are other sort of teeny-weeny sites that are all different, where actually then the assessment is a big part of the project, because it's no good going in there with big ideas saying, this is what we're going to do before you actually know, what the problem is. And that's...
Yeah. And also, isn't that's the fun of working with freshwater, really, and the challenge is that you don't know what lies beneath. I mean, if you look at a similar area of land there to the area that Joerg was talking about, that lake, you can see what's there. You can go out, you can map it straight away. But when it's in freshwater, you don't know what the plants are, you don't know what the animals are, you have to assess the water quality. So there's a lot more to it, and it's more mysterious and interesting. You have to suss that out before you can implement any sort of management action plans.
And how many of these sites you're having in your project?
Well, on my side, we're working on one lake. One bigger lake, Lough Arrow. It's not terribly big. I mean, it's about 3 miles long. Joerg then is working on a series of smaller precious lakes, the cross-border ones. Lough Arrow is actually all in the south. So Joerg, maybe you want to talk about those lakes?
Yeah, we've got, depends on how you count. So we've got 7 or 9 lakes. So they would, according to the documentation, there would be 7 lakes, but one of them, sort of historically one lake, but has been sort of subdivided by the large plants that grow around the water body, actually into 3 separate water bodies, which however are still connected, but they have their own characteristics. So that's why we've sort of looked at them also individually. But so the typical size is something like 2 to 3 hectares. The one that I mentioned before is the largest, actually.
Your work consists of kind of looking at the habitat on those lakes and also on the animals. So can you just tell us a little bit, like what type of habitats you're dealing with on those sites, and why are they important?
Well, that's a very good question. Well, Lough Arrow, which is the biggest lake, that is it's a special area of protection for wild birds, and it's a special area of conservation because it's a special type of alkaline lake. That's for anybody who knows the pH scale. It's up sort of up above 7, between probably around 8, pH 8. So, and what's there in that lake that's very special? A particular type of algae called stonewort. They're charophytes. Why are they important? Because they form the freshwater parallel of coral reefs in lakes, and they're beautiful and they're diverse, and that there are very many species of them. And in these little charophyte forests, you get a lot of the smaller insect life and freshwater crustaceans, and then you're going to get fish feeding in there. So it's protection, it's habitat, and it's a hunting ground. So they're very special lakes. So that I'm not hogging the program from Joerg, Lough Arrow is also very special because it's largely spring fed. So what a lot of people don't realize when they see rivers and lakes is that they're often very close to the water table. So there's water coming up from the ground as well. But Lough Arrow is a spring-fed lake, and it's got very clear water because of that, clear alkaline water. So that's why it's special. It's also one of the premier wild brown trout fishery lakes in Ireland.
Wow. And is there this is active fishery, so people are allowed to fish there?
Oh yeah. It's a publicly owned lake. It's managed by a state agency called Inland Fisheries Ireland, who do a very good job managing the lake, and anglers come there, particularly in May, when the mayfly is up to fish the trout. So there's a lot of boat activity on the lake. People just go stir crazy. Those anglers who like to catch the trout, they're out there as soon as the mayfly is up.
Yeah, I was gonna. So overall, how you would describe the condition of that lake and of the habitat right now? Is it favorable? Is it unfavorable?
See, it's actually unfavorable, which is very disappointing. And unfortunately, that's the case in Ireland at the moment. Only 50% of all our fresh waters are of good or high quality. So we've got almost 50% that are failing that test, and for lots of different reasons. The decline in water quality is linked to human activity. Mainly, of course, it's us humans that are doing the job on this. But climate change isn't helping either. The rise in temperature is not helping. But different activities in the catchment, forestry, agriculture, and of course human inputs of wastewater. Although that there's treatment plants there on the lake, there's obviously something happening there all the time, and the nutrient levels are up above where they should be, Tommy, and that's affected these charophytes. And then we have the big invader. So our biggest challenge in this CANN project is managing a new invasive plant, nuttall's weed, which is known as Elodea natalii. That just arrived in the lake about maybe 10 years ago, and it's taking over a lot of habitat. It's taking over a huge amount of habitat and competing with those stoneworts that I was just telling you about. So the stoneworts they have a double whammy: the decline in the water quality, and then this particular weed taking over from them.
I presume that's non-native invasive species.
It's a non-native invasive weed, yeah.
Right. And Joerg, on your side, is it you're dealing with the similar types of habitats and problems, or is it different?
It's of course different in size. So there's lots of smaller water bodies, but they are special in the UK context because there aren't that many hard water lakes that were nutrient poor in the UK, and also not in Northern Ireland. That's why they were, put under protections or designated as conservation sites. They also had a lot of these charophytes, probably still 20 years ago, which from people that I've talked to who did the surveys then were forming dense meadows, so on the bottom of the lake. And as Francis was saying, that's an important place that provides cover, provides also like a third dimension. Whenever you get a plant growing on a lake bottom or the sea bottom, you find that the diversity of animals then increases for one thing, just because of the structure. But the other thing that they did is, I mean, they're called stoneworts because they encrust themselves, or at least some of them do, with a calcium carbonate crust, which also probably helps to keep the phosphorus, usually the limiting nutrient in these systems, bound. And that means it's not available for phytoplankton. And that's why these lakes were once known for the clarity of their water. So they were like the jewels in the crown of that area there near the border around Clonus. And not many lakes are like that. So if your listeners have walked near a small lake, it will, in the summertime, they will remember dark green waters because a lot of them are very nutrient rich. And these were different. And that's, I think, in terms of sort of landscape, if you take a landscape scale view, that is important because that adds to the diversity that you have actually some lakes that are and remain nutrient poor. Unfortunately, they have gone downhill in that respect, and these are sort of processes that work over long time scales. So we have, for one of them, there's an indication that may have set in the 1950s, so that's from a core investigation that they've done some years ago, which would tie in with the period sort of when agriculture was generally intensified in Europe. So that makes sense. A lot of drainage intensification. And that means, maybe not large transfers in a particular year, but, if there is a transfer of nutrients from the land over decades, that changes the system. And in the end, it has led to pretty much a decline of the charophytes. That means also the phosphorus isn't bound in the same way, and there are lots of other consequences as well.
Yeah, when you're saying like a nutrients poor, you would think that this is something bad, but in this case, I presume this is actually the thing that stands out, that makes those habitats stand out. They're nutrient poor. That's in a good sense.
Yeah, the nutrients are the best thing is just when they're held back, right? You have just the right amount. And a lot of our systems in Ireland are just, naturally, they would be just at the right amount because they're on limestone and they're what we call mesotrophic. But, you bring in your inputs and then it's like, boom. It's like your lawn at home, Tommy, if you went out and you spread fertilizer on it and it just takes off. That's what we're basically talking about, fertilizing lakes. And sometimes these inputs Joerg is talking about, they come in and they're sitting on the bottom and they can get resuspended. And we don't, and that's actually really, really complex. And I know Joerg's PhD student was looking at these changes in a number of these small lakes. Every lake is different, and every lake is different over time and depending on all these different processes that are taking place seasonally and man's inputs. And it's like, when you make a cake, it's always different. It's a bit like that in a very simple way of looking at it. It's almost impossible and fascinating to see So we try to design, in Ireland, in Europe, in the United States, everywhere. You're trying to design, you're trying to model now. You're putting in all the data over many, many years to see what's driving this and how can we manage it. But it's like a best guesstimate. We're a long way off actually even finding out what's making the changes, not to mind how we actually could manage them, in a socio-economically acceptable way.
Yeah, I think Francis' example of the lawn is very good. That might bring it home. Basically, if I don't fertilize my lawn, I get even orchids growing there. But if I put the fertilizer on, they won't show anymore. They be outcompeted, and that is. But of course, the lawn gets more productive, so you get a lot more grass out of it. So if you just look at a lake and say, I want more fish out of this lake, well, then you'd be happy with the nutrient enrichment. But as I said, if you take the look at the landscape and you say, I want diversity and I want to preserve as much, I want to give space for all the animals and plants that have been here historically on this island, then I have to preserve those places that are nutrient poor and keep them nutrient poor as long as I can.
That's very interesting. Folks, what would you say to like a layman asking a question like, okay, so but why are they important, those nutrient poor habitats, those nutrients poor lakes, right? You're gonna put like a lot of like nutrients are a good thing, and then you have fish and all these life, everything springs to life in those lakes. So why we even bother of trying to preserve nutrient poor lake because of a carified stone, like, so why it is important? I'm obviously playing a little bit of a devil's advocate here.
Oh, we know you're being provocative. Okay, so yeah. Okay, so I think most people nowadays have heard about biodiversity, even if they might not really know exactly what it means. So, we're, as Joerg was saying, you're trying to keep all the species that are naturally present because, we want a very rich ecosystem. We want our lakes and rivers to have as many of those species, and some of them are what we call keystone species. They're like really important in those systems. So I don't know if Joerg wants to talk about the keystone species that they were working on in his lakes.
Yeah, I would say the charophytes are also keystone species for the reasons that we've talked about, because they generate that third dimension, and if they disappear, then a lot of the invertebrates that are usually not monitored disappear with them. I think, yeah. So
the crayfish is really what I was talking about.
Yeah, so we are also working on crayfish in these lakes. There are perhaps a bit of an unusual species in that, depending on which historic view you take, you might say, well, are they native or are they not? Because they've come here in the Middle Ages, and Julian Reynolds, I think, as a scholar from Dublin originally, he had gathered evidence that they would have come from France, and the suspicion is that they probably came with monks, liked eating them perhaps certain times of the year, and put them into lakes. So you might say at that time they would have been an invasive, but they have.
We're talking about the white claw crayfish.
So it's the only sort of European species that there is in Ireland. It's also found in on the other island in the UK, so England. And these European species have generally come under pressure from introductions of species, sometimes accidental, from North America or from Australia, but then usually also they've been introduced by people who wanted to farm them commercially. The bad side effect was that they brought with them some diseases that they had over time evolved to be able to cope with. So it's pretty much like, when the Europeans came to North America and brought with them sort of diseases that were normal here, and then these diseases met with the Indians and had a devastating effect on the population of the American Indians. So similarly, the European crayfish are dying from a pathogen that is called the crayfish, or the disease is called the crayfish plague, which is caused by a pathogen that these American crayfish brought with them. And as I said, they can cope with it. Ours can't. So the fact that the French crayfish were brought to Ireland in a way has been a good thing for the European species, in that they Ireland is now a place where there are some of the largest populations that still remain unaffected. And we've had, fortunately, very few outbreaks of the crayfish plague here. Question is, where those outbreaks came from. Different pieces of evidence that suggest that at least sometimes those outbreaks may have been caused by the pet trade, or at least the genetics are surprisingly similar to what is found in the Central European pet trade, at least for some of those outbreaks. But it's also possible, if people bring live bait from other places, or they haven't disinfected their angling gear properly, it is possible that would also be a vector to introduce the pathogen into a lake system.
But in the Magheraveely, Kilroosky lakes, you're really interested in them as they're not native, but you're trying to assess the populations. As part of the project.
They have been. Those lakes have been historically lakes where the populations size was really good compared to other places, and that's why the reason why these sites have been selected for conservation is also partly because of that historically good population size of the crayfish.
What is the current situation with white-clawed crayfish? Are they like in a really terrible state? Like, for example, freshwater pearl mussel, which, as far as I'm concerned, are very, very bad, or are they like okay? I had a signals from listeners that the crayfish plague is like a serious issue, at least in some rivers.
Yeah.
So from your perspective, like your folks are very close to that. How does it look like?
So they do reproduce in so at least in two of the lakes there is a decent sized population. In some lakes they appear to have disappeared. There's also been an attempt to sort of reintroduce them into a lake, which we found also no evidence that succeeded. So there's no survivor, or because that particular lake has a connection to a river, they may have just decided that it was better somewhere else and have left. We don't know, because that was a few years ago. Big difference is, of course, the generation time. So, the pearl mussel is a very sort of slow organism in that respect, and takes a long time to mature. Something like, correct me if I'm wrong, Francis, somewhere in the order at least 12 years, or before they even reach a size sort of
and then
sort of like the largest coin that you would have in your purse. So and they can, I think the latest that I read was they can get up to 200 years old. So if you have got that a good and reproducing population in your stream, then you know that must have been in good order for a very long time. The Crayfish is much shorter lived. So, within a year or two, depending on the feeding situation, you would have animals reaching maturity and they could reproduce. So if you had them in a hatchery, definitely in a year, as I said, outside depends on the food situation.
On the island of Ireland, where it is unusual though, in that that is the only species that we know of that's here. We are very, very concerned that the signal crayfish could be introduced here.
There's actually NPWS have found a population of an Australian species at a site that they won't disclose for good reasons. So
the yabbies,
Yes.
they're called. Yeah.
So the threat is there, and again, that is probably because of pet trade. So because these days, I think you can almost buy anything on the internet. I think that's the biggest concern, because there are also crayfish that, like if you think of the marble crayfish, that is even able to. Well, basically, if you put one animal in, it doesn't even need a sexual partner to reproduce. So that would be the worst nightmare, and they're very good at reproducing, and so an animal like that, could cause devastation in an ecosystem quite easily.
We've done a horizon scan for the whole country for invasive species to see which species are most likely to arrive. So that's why we need all the monitoring. The more monitoring that we have on our lakes, Tommy, the better. So this project the CANN project, Interreg project, has allowed for quite a bit of monitoring that we wouldn't be doing otherwise, in the national programs. So we're trying to educate more citizen scientists too, through various ways. And there is an app. The National Biodiversity Centre have an app that anybody can download. I'm sure it's been mentioned before, but I always like to mention it. And the people can take photos and upload them, and maybe they think it's invasive, maybe it's not, but it doesn't matter. The more these records that come in, the better, because even if we're trying to capture these species at the early stages, and it's all too often in freshwater, because of what I said earlier, you can't see what's there. We're not catching them in time. So we'd be really encouraging any fishers, as they're now called for equality and gender purposes, any fishers out there, anglers, anybody that just likes messing around in water, that are out in their canoes, if they think they find something, please take a photo and upload it. That would be great.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, we had an episode some time ago about with the folks from the Biodiversity Ireland. So thanks for bringing that up. Listen, folks. So, are you also dealing with the freshwater pearl mussel, or is it not part of a program?
No, that's not part of this program. No.
Okay.
You actually need a license. Yeah, you need a license. Just to mention that, Tommy, so in case anybody's going out doing a survey themselves, you if you think you found pearl mussel, don't touch them, because you can't go near them. They're so endangered.
Yeah, and they're in a dire situation. So it's good to hear that the crayfish is not that down.
There are native mussels in the lake, though. I mean, other mussels in the lakes. So that's perhaps also worth mentioning. And we found in one of our lakes, we found another invasive species, so the zebra mussel.
Yeah.
Surprise.
So
Please tell us about it and what to do and what not to do.
Well, the people living beside the lakes actually were proud that they had several species of mussels, because they could see that there were large ones and small ones, and they are good people that take an interest in the water that they live by. So they said, we've got quite a variety here. So we were intrigued and had a look, and then we were all together disappointed to find that the smaller one actually was the zebra mussel.
And now we have the quagga mussel too. So basically, Tommy, people need to check, clean, disinfect and dry, really. So important. It's just they move around attached to boats very often attached to weed that's attached to equipment, to boat wheels, in engines. So but they reproduce in the summertime, and the young are very small, so you might not see them with the naked eye. So
Yeah, the
really
larvae
miss
are tiny.
moving boats around.
And
Yeah.
in that particular case, also was actually the other thing that intrigued us. There was that that was a lake where there were no anglers, or that is not as a lake without fishing stands. And probably the most likely route into that lake would have been the connection to the river. So probably, that whole river catchment is in a way seasonally gets these larvae, and they just happen to get into that lake. So it's probably no fault of anyone living beside the lake or using the lake, because it's very rare that somebody would be on a boat there, and usually they would, I think there's a farmer on the third lake of that systems that sometimes has summer guests, but it sounds like these they would also not bring boats usually. And that is also not the lake where it's in, because it's the lake close to the river that has got them. So
Yeah, they can move like that, and even lakes that you think are disconnected, they may be connected in the wintertime when the water levels are up. So yeah. I'll send you the paper, Joerg. I have a paper on that.
My university is also,
we did it on downstream transport.
Close to the River Bann. So we had a PhD student who was looking at them in Lough Neagh, and then found them all the way down from Lough Neagh, throughout the Bann. So they have an enormous potential to extend their range. That is something.
And of course, where Joerg is now in Lake Michigan, there are trillions in there.
Yeah,
in the
I
Great
just
Lakes.
heard the other day that they're also capable of. So initially they were just in the shallows, but they keep improving. For the mussels. So they are now also on substrates where they previously weren't. So over time,
and the quagga mussels are taking over from the zebra mussels in the Great Lakes. So that's really interesting. But these invaders, Tommy, I know we shouldn't be talking about them in such glowing terms. We don't want them in the country. We really don't. But we do. They are so successful and for so many different reasons, and we don't know. An awful lot of species are introduced, but maybe 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000 may be the successful one. So people really need to know not to empty their aquaria into lakes. Releasing plants, releasing animals. They think they're being. It's the humane thing to do, but they could actually be causing devastating damage to an ecosystem, or more than one ecosystem.
Yeah, that's for sure.
So if you think about it like a pebble, dropping a pebble into the water, and the pebble is your initial site where your species is introduced, and then you get the ripples, and that's what happened with the zebra mussel. It came into the Shannon, and then it spread out. It spread up the Shannon, and then it spread outwards from the Shannon, because we traced it. I was studying it from its earliest invasion years, and it just had that ripple effect, and you could see it spreading, and eventually it got into the Western Lakes, and it's in Lough Arrow as well, in the lake that we were studying for the CANN project.
Wow. Okay, so just to finish off on this, because I think this is important. For sure there's a lot of anglers listening to this episode. What advice would you give to a responsible angler, or for an angler who wants to be responsible? What to do? They're done fishing in a lake. What would you recommend to do then?
Disinfect your gear. There are really.
Yeah, but like how am I gonna disinfect my gear? This is a question.
Yeah, Francis is closely cooperating with people who are really experts on that. So.
Yeah, so we call it biosecurity. So first of all, they should think about the gear they're buying, Tommy. So probably better not to buy boots with felt soles, because they're notoriously bad at first. Well, they can spread species very easily. So think about what you're buying, we know, anglers, that some of your fishing rods are way more expensive than my car is. They're very, very expensive and precious, and you'd take them to bed at night with you if you could, probably. So I think, you have to be reasonable about it. We're not expecting you to put them into concentrated disinfectant where they may be discolored or you may be worried that they're damaged. But, if you can clean them, you just boil the kettle and let the water, cool down to, maybe 60 degrees or something like that, very hot, like as hot as your hand can take it, and rinse off you. That's not going to damage your rod or your
it's
gear.
80-degree probably.
Anything that you can take, anything. It would be better if you could, anything that you can take apart and wash, please do that. Think about your bait boxes. They're really important because you could be carrying water with you as well as actual, that has invasive species. Clean your keep nets if you're a coarse fisherman. They're really important, and you can certainly put those into boiling water. If you can buy these Virkon or any kind of proprietary disinfectant, even Vanadine or something like that from your farmer's co-op, and just follow the instructions on how to actually disinfect your gear. Dry it if you can. And we know that you can take it. You can take your boat. Some people can do this, and some people it's difficult for them to take their boat and clean it, but in the local garage, which you really should do that. Or if you've got a boat on your lake and you fish with, if you're Johnny and you fish with Mark and Mark has a boat on another lake, could you just try not to move the boats from lake to lake? That would really help.
I was gonna say that in Spain there's this regulation when you're registering your watercraft, your boat, your vessel, whoever you call it, you're registering for the body of water, and you cannot move it to a different body for that precise reason. So for many people it's like a shock. Like, what are you saying? I'm buying a boat and I can only use it on this lake. Yes, that's what your license is, and then you can change the licensing, but there's some regulation on that as well, that you cannot basically game the system to change the registration all the time.
But the education piece will always be the best anyway
for sure,
people to understand that. And also I would also say to anglers, it has happened in the past that anglers have introduced fish. Chub were introduced to Ireland on at least one occasion, that they would like to introduce an extra, a good fighting fish into our waters. So please don't do that. Go and fish in the country where those fish are found. And certainly, if you're coming back into Ireland from if you're coming from the Baltic states or somewhere, if you've been salmonid fishing somewhere else, really make sure that you clean your tackle, because Gyrodactylus, the salmon fluke, if we got that into Ireland, it would really devastate the industry here, the whole of angling, and it would, well, not the industry, I should completely not say that, but the actual native Irish salmon would be really under threat if we got that into our systems. So Norway, the Baltic states, it's endemic in some of the waters up there.
We've talked to anglers who've also told us that also on our sites they have actually in the past, we talked to some of the people who had actually introduced fish into those lakes and now regret it, after they know how special they were. So that's always a temptation, but we can only really ask people to refrain from doing that. You will find. Surely you will find them in other lakes, but keep those, especially those designated lakes, try to keep them the way that they are, because we never know what effects that will have on the whole system.
Yeah, it'll affect all the plants and animals, and as well as that, in a very small lake, they poo a lot, They produce a lot of nutrients themselves.
And then they're not nutrient poor anymore.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, and the other thing I wanted to add to what Francis was saying is, again, maybe you know better whether that actually is a practice that is widespread, but I've heard repeatedly that some people do bring live bait from lake to lake. So please not do that, because obviously if you bring water and live animals in there, there is a fair chance that there's something microbial in there, like the crayfish plague pathogen that you would unwittingly also transfer into those lakes.
Yeah. So we sort of strayed a little bit from the project because that's who we are. We're freshwater ecologists. But yeah, just to say, we people might say, well, what did you do in Lough Arrow? You talked a lot about these different things. Well, we did actually have a management plan, and where we put down jute matting onto the bottom of the lake. So there's a publication on that. If anybody wants to just Google Lough Arrow jute matting, you'll find it. So we actually covered over the invasive weed and stopped it from growing. And so when we did some experimentation on that, it's been done on other lakes, but what we did was we made a biosecurity route. So we made a sort of a roadway out of the main fishing area where boats can come in and out on that road, as you might call it. It's between buoys, so it means that they're not actually entraining the weed on their boats, leaving the lake and spreading it to other lakes. And we've got some really nice posters, information posters up the side of the lake as well. So anybody who might be travelling around Ireland and wants to have a look around at Lough Arrow, the signs are there, and it's a really beautiful lake. So you should go and take a look at it anyway. And Lough Key beside it. Yeah,
that's for sure. And it seems like your folks are at least in contact a lot with anglers. Like overall, would you say that anglers are, like a environmentally conscious bunch, or would you say that there is a negative impacts as well?
Well, what I think about anglers is I think that they, in many ways, are part of the ecosystem in a way that they're part of nature in a way that a lot of other people aren't. And, they are the eyes and ears. We often hear, we get a lot of information as biologists from anglers. So personally, I don't fish myself. I sample, but I certainly catch and release is, if it's done effectively, is the way to go. You're not affecting the environment too much as long as the fish is healthy going back in. They've got a chance, and that the angler's got the fun of catching the fish and then putting it back. Yeah,
fantastic.
But, it's that's.
I can't agree more.
They're part of nature. They're part of nature too, Tommy.
Yeah, the ones I've met have always been nice people, but they've also been complaining about others that they knew were coming to the site, and in some cases we've also seen what they've left behind. So that is also particularly sad if you find rubbish on these sites, because I think, cans, when you bring them, they're heavier when you bring them. So you should be able to bring them home when they're empty.
Yeah. Leave no trace, Tommy.
Yeah.
I'm sure you've
and take your rubbish with you, folks. Take your rubbish with you. That's listen, folks. I just want to ask you a question, which is again maybe a little bit of tangent of the CANN project, but very much on topic of what we're discussing here. You already mentioned that one of those species, the white-clawed crayfish, this is like it became native at some point. What is your view on the whole situation of agreeing, like what's native, what's non-native? Because as far as I'm concerned, this is interesting and sometimes tricky conversation in terms of like, oh, look, that these things wasn't there, and then nature is changing all the time, and we decide, like as humans, we decide like, okay, this is a point in time where stuff is native, and this is what we protect, right? And you could make an argument that then those other signal crayfish or whatever, they're part of nature. They're better adapted to the environment, and if we put those signal crayfish, fast forward 100 years, they're native. So what's your view on this?
My view is this, right? Back then, we didn't even have when the crayfish was introduced, science was not well established in this area. We didn't even have proper names for species. So I think that now we do know about the impacts and the potential impacts. So I think we need to have an informed conscience about it, Tommy, and not make these introductions now. I mean, in the past, they didn't know. The monks who brought them in were bringing them in for fish. Maybe they thought it was a good idea. So yeah, that would be my thesis on it. I don't know about Joerg's.
Yeah, I think especially on those protected sites, which are protected for a reason, in that they're rare in their characteristics. We should not try to change those, because, as I said, any introduction that you would do there could have unforeseen consequences. So, and even as aquatic ecologists who have been dealing in that or doing research in that subject for a number of years, I'm sure Francis would agree that we don't really feel that we would be able to foresee the consequences of any such introduction in its entirety, because you would really have to know the whole system. And as Francis was saying, every lake tends to be a little bit special. So, it could easily go, even if you think it could easily go in another way. And there are multiple examples also in research where people thought if we only did that, we get the system to react in a way that we wanted to. And then they found, oh no, there's another mechanism in there that we thought wasn't that important. And that actually is now the dominating one. So, for example,
introduction of rabbits to Australia, for example.
The human history is littered with examples, I think, where you have really large unintended consequences. So I think, yes, there will be changes in species and in some ways for the landscape, and that is, in part is a natural process. If you think of the ice ages, and the trees slowly spreading out again towards areas that were formerly glaciated. And so, there will probably be other trees coming also to Ireland, and that's fine. But I think in these special places, we should certainly not try to accelerate the change.
And a word you used twice, Joerg, was slowly. You said that twice this evening, and I really liked that, because that is the difference. Well, with the invader, sometimes it takes an invader a while to get established, and it has this, what we call this lag phase, but then the change is so fast. And you're dealing with species that are here, we call them naive. They're naive to the invader, and everything is this is too fast. This is like you went home this evening and your house was absolutely full of a certain type of animal, right? And you're trying to get in the door, right? They weren't there this morning, and you can't, if you go in there, they'll eat you, right? So that's nothing. You don't want anything to be that sudden, really.
I heard about this concept of evolutionary naivety when it comes to predators or some other species, that they just cannot deal with the non-natives. Listen, folks. So, at what phase is a project now? So, how are you almost done? Like, how much is left, and where are you now?
Well, I've got a PhD student that needs to finish writing up, and I'd just like to mention the PhD students on the project who've been absolutely excellent. So my student Darren Garland, he needs to finish up and write up. I don't know what stage Joerg's student is at. Other than that,
dear students, if you listen to that, no pressure.
I'm meeting him on Thursday of this weekly meeting. No, I must say that the students have done so much, and my student particularly has been involved in a lot of project management, so he's learned an awful lot of skills. He's been doing a lot of really interesting biomolecular work on looking at the cyanobacteria, the toxic algae in the lake, and all sorts of different types of work. So he could do a whole podcast with you easily. So I don't know where Joerg is with his student.
Yeah, Raymond Wilson is also writing up. So, there have been first chapter drafts, but there's still also a lot of data analysis to do. So he's been going very much into, for example, learning how to measure radon in the lakes and
Oh, yeah.
to
It was another thing they did.
get a better estimate. I mean, so in the past, they've always said, yeah, these lakes, they do receive groundwater. And this is the first time that we are trying to get close to a better estimate of how much groundwater at certain times of the year, and also to document how that changes throughout the year. So he's been doing a lot of work also through the pandemic. I mean, he's been working in his garden shed to try to improve the apparatus when there were access restrictions to laboratories. So both of them are really dedicated people, and that's also one of the outcomes of the project, is that we will have two new scientists who will have
That's it.
gained
Because while we take a long time and we're very slow, we won't be here forever. So yeah, I love that. I love the legacy of the project is having these two new super scientists on board that have really learned to work with the larger CANN team. They've been involved in a lot. They've given presentations, and they've learned to work individually and in teams. And huge thanks and kudos to the whole CANN team and to Interreg for funding it to allow these students to grow and learn.
Yeah. Also, the crayfish we were talking about before is also that has been surveyed by the PhD students, and that always also leads to new questions. For example, where and how good is actually the surveying technique that has been employed so far. He's been done also mark recapture studies, so where we've used a bit of nail varnish, for example, to mark crayfish so that we could find them again. So I mean, they shed their exoskeleton usually once a year.
That's a lot of legs to paint the nails on, Joerg.
Yeah. I wish it had been as delicate as that, so we're not that good. Yeah, but that was also useful in finding out actually how they move. So that's quite interesting. So you can see also how, if you did get a pathogen into the lake, how quickly that would spread in a population like that, because there are individuals that sort of travel around the lake margin. We assume, several hundred meters. Probably the ones that have like a competitive disadvantage. So it seems that crayfish can lose claws and regrow them, but then they have tiny claws. They can't really fight with those. But it's amazing that you can regrow a limb. It's not that much good for your competitive edge in the population. And we found that it seems that animals that have had such a loss because they were involved in a fight that didn't end well for them, that they may have to work really hard to find a new place where they let them be. So
nature is very cruel.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's true. Folks, I just have one other question. I read about the project that you're also looking at the management of the vegetation. Is that the vegetation like in the lake, or is it like around the lake?
That was the vegetation, probably that nuttall's weed that I was telling you about.
Oh, this one
covering it. But we did actually think at the start that we were going to have to look at the reeds around the lake to see. Reed beds are really important habitats for bird life. And we thought that and possibly small mammals, but it turned out that there was nothing wrong with the reed beds. But what we did do towards the end of the project, Tommy, is we got a lot of the schools in the Lough Arrow catchment, and I'm really glad you brought this up now, because I needed to mention it. So we got the school kids on board, and we had them down at the lake and did some training with them on not quite as much as the PhD students, but they dipped their toes in the water. They learned about some of the insect life in the lake, and we're also producing a booklet for them. And that's one of our legacy items for the project is a book that kids and locals can have, just some information on the lake and about what the work we did on the lake and everything. So just hoping that the water will and hoping that the water will improve in time. It's measured for the Water Framework Directive. So we hope that the more people know about it, the more it just inch by inch, basically, because a lot of the inputs are very diffuse. So people may change their practices a little bit and improve the quality of the lake.
So is it mainly based on education and kind of highlighting to people to change their practices, so to minimize the amount of nutrients that are going to those lakes?
Yeah, I believe so. Yeah, I mean, I know you can talk to the industries different, the water industry, the wastewater industry, but I think for management for ecological management in general, worldwide, that education and awareness plays a huge part. It certainly does with the invasive species, with biodiversity. We've got a meeting tomorrow in ATU Sligo to talk about trying to engage people to work on the biodiversity in the town. So it's all about the people. It's people power. We're such a kind of a useless species compared to all the other ones, even though we have all the brain power. But we just need to put it into good practice, best practice, and people need to understand. Most times they don't know; they have no clue. So, but they do love the environment, especially kids, and especially after COVID. A lot of people became very aware of the environment, and I think it's a really good time to get people on board to steward their own environment.
Yeah, especially if they became aware of the local environment. I think that is much more, rather than just going to other countries for holidays.
That's it, Joerg, and they know they're part of it. They're part of it rather than being apart from it and looking at it like on television. They actually became a part of it because every day they were kind of doing the same walk, and so they could see this particular flower coming up, that particular tree. They became very aware of their local environment.
That's very important. That's very important because, like you said, people, kids especially, they tend to, when you talk about nature and animals, they tend to think about zebras and hippos and elephants, while they're usually not have much knowledge about what's outside their own doors. And this is again one of the kind of repeating themes in a podcast, that this education is very important, because then kids who are aware and then growing up with that, then they will basically pay more attention and even protect
see that they actually have some play schools that are outdoors now.
Yeah, I heard that.
Kids are spending most of the time outdoors. Yeah.
Wow, that's a good change.
Maybe not in Ireland.
Well,
I think you need the weather for it.
You get a good waterproof jacket and you're good to go.
Yeah.
Folks, just to finish off, I'm gonna ask you a question. I'm asking all the scientists who I speak with, and in general, from the perspective of your work on these freshwater sites, but also wider picture of the nature. What are your views for the future? Are you overall optimistic for the future, for nature, for the planet? Or are you rather, not so optimistic?
Well, I live in the present, as we all do, and I work on what we have in the present with as many people as I can through my work in education and research, and I am optimistic. Cautiously optimistic. I think people are becoming much more aware. I think our legislation is also heading in the right direction in terms of, just making member states sit up and actually act on biodiversity issues. Climate change is a huge challenge, and in freshwater ecology, it certainly is. But I'm I live in the present, as I say. I don't have a doomsday scenario, and I just, I'm optimistic that people are becoming more engaged and that there are more resources being put into this area.
Good to hear that. How about you, Jörg?
Yeah, I've recently heard optimists have a high chance of living longer, so I would like to live longer.
That's a very selfish attitude, Joerg.
Yeah, but so I think no. If you're not an optimist, basically, then you just let everything run its course. Then it's certainly going to end in doom. So I have faith in especially in the young people, also the ones that we're teaching. You have to recognize, though, that the challenge is enormous. It's also, with my change perspective here at the moment, I see that, there's an awful lot to do in changing attitudes in terms of consumption, because we're still behaving like there's no tomorrow. So the rate of change will have to be really, really drastic. There's no way around.
I think we have to change. We have to change our culture, And I was delighted. My 25-year-old came to me the other day and showed me the 4 sweatshirts that he'd ordered online, secondhand. He said these are all from the 80s. They're going to last me 10 years at least. I thought, wow, we're getting state. We're getting it's in some cases. It's about, well, we all have to take individual actions. And I said, are all your friends doing this? And he said, yeah, absolutely. He said, that's the attitude we're taking. So I think, the more education, the better. And just, and the more we work together in different ways. So individual actions, big actions. And I'm optimistic.
Support that from my son's friends. It seems that there's a different consciousness there in at least a large part of that generation. So that's a hopeful sign. But as I said, the change will have to be drastic, and I think most of us haven't really thought it through entirely. How big the change in consumption pattern will have to be to get into a good place, and the change that will be happening nonetheless. That is apparent everywhere. So when I came here, for example, I saw springtime and I saw trees with yellow leaves already. So the change also here with their continental climates. So the dry season setting in much earlier than it used to. The signs are everywhere. So if we don't act now, it's going to be an awful lot more difficult to ensure the survival of our species.
There's a hint of the pessimist now, Jörg, and you're overall optimistic and but that's it's refreshing, because usually, well, maybe not usually, but quite often I hear a very pessimistic views. So
no,
you two are
we have
very
to be fighters,
and in the grand scheme of things, on the average answer I'm getting for this question, you're up there in the optimism.
Yeah, we have to keep fighting. We have to fight.
I agree.
It's so important.
That's probably because we're dealing with young people. If you were, I can see that it would be easier to fall into absolute pessimism if you weren't.
Yes, that's that. This is a pattern I noticed, that that it usually depends on the age. Like the younger people tends to be more optimistic. So that's another observation. So I agree. That's probably part of it. Folks, thank you very much for your time. It's been an absolutely fantastic conversation. Yeah, thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks,
I've enjoyed it.
And thanks to Interreg for funding the project.
Yes.
Of course.